Trump has filed a massive class action lawsuit against the digital media companies, Twitter specifically and Facebook. And the fact that it's a class action suit means it's not just on Trump's behalf, it's on behalf of the whole class of people, actually us, who are being restricted, censored, banned, shadow banned, tagged, flagged in various ways by these social media moguls. Now, Alan Dershowitz, the former Harvard Law School professor, prominent attorney, thinks that this could be a landmark First Amendment case. Listen.
This is the most important First Amendment case of the 21st century, and it's important because it pits freedom of speech on the one hand against the First Amendment on the other hand. That may sound paradoxical, but remember, it's the high-tech giants that are banning freedom of speech. They are censoring, but they're claiming the right to do so under the First Amendment. So they're using the First Amendment as a sword against freedom of speech.
So Dershowitz here, I think, is making a sophisticated point, which is to say that these digital media platforms are rallying behind the First Amendment. The First Amendment, by the way, which restricts government action, particularly congressional action, against free speech. And they're saying we are exercising free speech. So the paradox here, which I think Dershowitz is highlighting, is that they're invoking the First Amendment to suppress speech. They're saying it's our platform. Essentially, all of Twitter reflects our First Amendment speech, and we can allow or disallow any opinions as we see fit. And this is really what Trump is setting out to challenge. Now, here is a lot of people have been snickering at Dershowitz's comment as if it's manifestly absurd. Here's the Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu. He goes, "Tomorrow I'm suing Fox News for not having me on every day, and the New York Times for not publishing my op-eds." And then he concludes that the First Amendment, quote, does not apply to private sector companies. But I think that this is intellectually a little shoddy for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you send in an op-ed to the New York Times, you don't have a contract with the New York Times. The New York Times is not obliged to you in any way. But the truth of it is, when you sign up for Twitter or Facebook, you enter into a contract with those companies. And so you have contractual rights that come out of that. The second issue is that the digital platforms are, in fact, collectively and often in coordination, regulating America's public square. So our democratic debate takes place not inside of government. It's not government agencies sending memos to each other. It takes place outside of government, but in a public square. And a handful of digital platforms control that public square. Think, for example, of the impact of, say, Google in controlling even what information is available to you. They control the search itself. So that's not the same as an op-ed to a newspaper or even a single TV cable station. Now, to recognize the free speech implications of what we're dealing with, think of it this way. What if the phone company started regulating speech, regulating the speech that was transmitted on the phone? And when you said you can't do that, we have a right to say whatever we want, the phone company goes, well, we have a First Amendment right to suppress it. We're a private company. And so we are exercising our First Amendment rights. We are not undermining the First Amendment. We are appealing to the First Amendment on our behalf. But yet, the effect of it would be to deny the whole swath of Americans access to free speech on the phone. And imagine if all the private phone companies, and there are only a handful of them, coordinated with each other, and they all decided to regulate speech in the same way. Wouldn't that be a free speech problem? Of course it would. Now, Trump gets into this, and he points out that the digital media companies are suppressing speech not because the speech is pornographic or because it is hate speech. They're not limited to outlawing epithets. He says they are, quote, manipulating and controlling the political debate itself. And he gives three telling examples. One, the debate about whether coronavirus came from a Chinese lab. Millions of people were suppressed, censored, and because this was supposed to be misinformation, even though it was not misinformation. Number two, he says that big tech has censored physicians from discussing potential treatments like hydroxychloroquine on the grounds that hydroxychloroquine hydroxychloroquine doesn't work, except that studies have now shown that hydroxychloroquine does work. It often does work in particular contexts. It can be an effective treatment. And yet, big tech has decided that no discussion of this could be allowed. And third, the platforms banned the New York Post, America's oldest newspaper, for publishing a story critical of Joe Biden, a story the Biden family did not even contest. And then Trump goes on to say that even when he was president, this is after the election, big tech banned him. They're banning the social media accounts of a sitting president. And he could have gone on to say, although he doesn't, but I would add, that he is now the leader of one of the two major parties in the United States. And so essentially, although the big tech platforms say we're trying to foster debate, how do you foster debate while shutting down the leading spokesman of one of the two major parties? Essentially, what you're doing is creating a one-party state. Trump goes on to say that these companies aren't really entirely private in the manner that they pretend to be. He goes, first of all, he says that Democrats in Congress exploit the Section 230 exemption leverage to coerce platforms into censoring their political opponents. He says the Democrats have come up with a clever scheme. They've created a kind of bogus fact-checking apparatus, and on the basis of fact-checking these tweets, they decide this is false, even though it's not false. It's only arguable. You don't agree with it, but that doesn't make it false. On this pretext, they can censor you. And he says in practice, this amounts to suppression of speech. And second, they talk about how the digital platforms rely frequently on government agencies to tell them what to do. The FBI says this, therefore we're going to remove everybody else who says that. The CDC says this, so anyone who says the contrary is going to be banned. So again, these platforms aren't operating in the private realm. They don't even have their own criteria to decide what is allowed and what's not. They're simply taking instructions from the government itself. So this makes them, says Trump, extensions of the government, or at least working in coordination with the government. And the key point here is that the First Amendment doesn't just prohibit government from regulating speech, it prohibits government from working with private platforms to do the same thing. And that is exactly what is going on. I think for these reasons, this is not a frivolous case. This is actually a case that raises fundamental issues. Alan Dershowitz is right. I expect this is going to be weaving its way through the courts. It could be that Trump will lose at the lower court level and then have to push his way up. And this may well get to the Supreme Court. But I think without resolving this issue, it's very difficult to say anymore that in terms of the ability to speak our minds, America is still a free society.